Yeah. This is the oddest way of doing church.
I'm thankful for it, though.
Oh, me too. Me too. And the odd thing is we've been doing most of our administrative meetings on Zoom, trustees and finance and those kinds of things. And we have far better attendance on Zoom than we ever did in person. I mean, it's 100%. Everybody's there for that. And so, and I've had lots of conference meetings and sort of general church meetings, which has caused me to wonder, why do we ever want to go back to actually driving or flying someplace and meeting when we can do this? It's so much easier. So. Good evening, Jill McGavin. Great to have you. And Brian Houston. Okay. All right. I think we're about all here, Dan.
Yeah, I think we should probably proceed. We have I'm seeing about Facebook. We don't quite have the feed going on Facebook yet, but
it is on Facebook.
All right, I'm seeing just the still image of the Holy Land with Jack.
Okay, let's pray without Facebook if we have to. Okay. Lord Jesus, thank you for this night and for the time that we have to take together here. We've gathered from many places and scattered across the area, but we're not scattered from you. So thank you for your promise to be with your people always, and we would invite you to be in this Zoom conversation and study tonight. We ask it in your name. Amen.
Amen.
Okay. Well, welcome back to, this is our fourth session looking at the Holy Land through the perspective of our favorite Bible geographer, Dr. Jack Beck. As always, we want to begin by giving our gratitude to Jack and to Our Daily Bread Ministries for the permission to use these videos in this series. And also my own gratitude to Pastor Dan and Oliver Carlock, who makes these things happen technically when I have no clue how to do any of that. We began 4 weeks ago talking about the city of Jerusalem itself. We noted that it was a really unlikely place for anybody to ever build a capital city. It didn't have enough water, it didn't have enough food, it didn't have enough arable land, and it was out of the way, well off of all the main roads. Then we looked at how that city, however, despite all of that, Jerusalem, it became a place which is home not just to one, but to three major faith traditions, all of which have a connection back to one man. Who is that?
Abraham.
Abraham, yeah. They're all Abrahamic religions, Judaism, Christianity, Islam. There's, I think, 27 prophets in Islam. Jesus is next to last, I believe, before Muhammad. But the ones before that are all Old Testament. I mean, so there's a really strong connection for Islamic faith to this land as well. We suggested as well that there was a very deep kind of connection to the same theological understanding that there is but this one God. And that is what made the temple in Jerusalem so significant. And in turn, why its destruction was so devastating, absolutely devastating to the whole nation of Israel. Now, we took a break last week for our national rite of passage. And hopefully everyone has recovered from that. So tonight,
not yet.
Yeah, well, we'll get there, Mike. Tonight, we're going to leave the city of Jerusalem and move out into what is known as the hill country of Judea. Now, we've mentioned before that if you take a look at Israel, despite its rather narrow width, it's not but 17 to 30 miles across at its widest spot. From the Mediterranean on the west to the Jordan River on the east, the mountains there. There are 4 distinct regions in this very small land. Begins on the coastal plains, which are relatively low and flat, a lot like South Texas coastal plains. I mean, we those of us who live here in Fort Bend County, I believe we live 50 feet above sea level. Up in Lakewood, it's a little further, it's a little higher, but not a whole lot. Because the change in elevation across all of Houston is no more than 7 or 8 feet, as big as the city is. So it's low and it's flat, and it's and that's kind of how the coastal plains are. The only difference really is that the area along the coastal plains is by and large fairly marshy. It's not an area where people, let's go to the beach. There are some places, Haifa, also Caesarea Maritima, but a lot of it's just not very attractive land. But when you go a little bit in from that, you kind of rise into some hill country. There is farming on the coastal plains, yes. There's agriculture there, but there's also no defenses there whatsoever. I mean, it's, as I say, it's flat, it's easy to invade if you don't get stuck in the marsh. But when you go in just a little further, there's this hill country known as the Shephelah. That's Hebrew for humble hills. It's remarkably like the Texas hill country to me. It's the same kind of Eocene limestone. It has some sharp ridges. It forms into fairly dramatic V-shaped valleys. This hill country, or the Shephelah, is also known as Judea. It's interesting because the difference will be between Judea in the south and Galilee in the north, okay? So in places like John 6, where it talks about Jesus stayed up in Galilee because of fear of the Jews, or because of the Jews. That's how it's translated. Well, you could easily translate it because of the Judeans. It's the same word. And it's not that because Galilee is full of Jews too. He's talking about the people who live in the south who have a whole different kind of mindset to that. Judea is where a lot of biblical stories happen. David is there, Goliath, the Valley of Elah, which represents a really significant place because if the Philistines, who live on the coast primarily, they're thought by some to be descendants of the Phoenicians. So if the Philistines are able to control the Valley of Elah, what they get is pretty easy access to the interior of the country. There's an east-west ridge going through there. That's why it's an important place. Humble hills become the sort of central mountains. Those rise 1,500 to 3,000 feet. They support even less agriculture than in the hill country. And as we're going to see in a few moments, farming is done primarily by building terraces on the hillside. Enormously labor intensive, both to construct them and to maintain them. Then beyond the mountains, which actually surround Jerusalem, I will lift up my eyes unto the hills, from which does my help come. There is in fact the Jordan Rift Valley, and that will come down from the Sea of Galilee along the Jordan River through the Dead Sea. Now, that's where the water ends. That's not where the Rift Valley ends. The Rift Valley actually begins up in Arabia, comes all the way down, and goes all the way down into Africa, into Kenya. And if you've been in Kenya, I've got to go for some mission work there. I've been in the same Rift Valley there. This rift line runs 4,000 miles. Geologically, what it is a collapsed landscape. It's formed because right here is the juncture of two tectonic plates, the plate of Arabia and the African plate. What that means is that there's about 200 tremors per day along that Rift Valley. And some of them become extreme. So when you go to Israel now, you'll go to a place like Beck, Sepphoris, other places, and you'll see that an earthquake came at some point and just everything fell down. That area in the Jordan River Valley is hot, very little rainfall, minimal agricultural production. Whereas in Jerusalem, you will get about 22 inches of rain per year. It doesn't sound like much, does it, for us? I know when I lived in Alvin held the record for the most rainfall in a 24-hour period in all of North America, 42 inches at the time, which had fell in Alvin in one 24-hour period, following which they moved the National Weather Service station from Alvin over to Lead City. Now I believe that record has been beaten by Harvey here in the area too. But we can get 42 inches in a day. They get 22 inches per year, half of that. But just 15 miles to the east in Jericho, average rainfall is 5 inches per year. So you can kind of see how this is playing itself out in terms of the stories. And finally, there is that sort of Transjordan region, meaning everything to the east of the Jordan River. But it is the Judean hill country that we're interested in for this session. This is the land of Abraham. Now, who can remind us of something about old Abe? And don't say he was honest, because he wasn't really. What do you remember about Abraham? And he didn't have many sons. Many sons had Father Abraham. No, that's wrong too.
He liked to present his wife as a sister.
Yeah. Why would he do that, George?
Save his skin.
Yeah, because she was pretty. And Egyptians thought, I like her. All I have to do is to kill her husband, and then she's free. He was pretty deceptive about that, particularly when he was in Egypt. What else about Abraham?
He had two sons, Ishmael and
Isaac.
Isaac.
Ishmael by Hagar, who is the servant girl, and Isaac by, of course, his wife Sarah. Where does Abraham come from? Anybody remember?
He comes from Mesopotamia, Babylon.
Yeah. It comes specifically from a place called Ur of the Chaldees. That's actually Babylonia, Mesopotamia. It's along the Tigris and the Euphrates River area. It's part of the Fertile Crescent, which will then come across and come down through Israel, moving that way. Why does he go to Canaan in the first place?
God tells him to.
Yeah, Liz, go ahead.
God told him to.
Yeah. Do you do everything God tells you to do? I mean, there's something going on here, isn't there? I mean, it's kind of amazing. If you have your Bible, turn over to Genesis chapter 12 for a minute. He's still being called Abram at this point. God hasn't changed his name yet. And who has Genesis chapter 12, verses 1 to 4 that would like to participate tonight and read it for everybody? Anybody like public reading of scripture?
Well, this is King James, but
let's not do King James then.
I'll give it a try.
Well, okay, go ahead. Yeah, why not?
Okay.
King James is fine. Jesus spoke King
12:1.
James. Yeah.
Now the Lord had said unto Abram, get thee out of thy country and from thy kindred and from thy father's house unto a land that I will show thee, and I will make of thee a great nation, and I will bless thee, and make thy name great, and thou shalt be a blessing. And I will bless them that bless you, and curse them that curse thee. And in thee shall all families of the earth be blessed.
Okay.
So,
thank you. Let's stop there for a minute.
Okay.
It does sound kind of nice, doesn't it, to hear the these and thous? Every time I'm at a meeting and people ask me, as is now the sort of custom to do, what are your preferred pronouns? What I really want to say is thee and thou. So those are the ones that I think I ought to be actually listening to. So he comes from Ur of the Chaldees, and how it's, I will make you into a great nation. Get up, leave your country, your people, and your father's household. How explicit is God's call to Abraham, as he's known at the time, or Abram? Are there travel brochures God gives them and says, oh, look at this. This is a great place you're going to. Does God give him some maps? Does he even give him the name of the place he's going to go to sort of put into his GPS? No. God just says what? Get up, go from your country. Artseka, it means your earth, land, or region. It comes from a Hebrew verb meaning to be from. So go from where you're from, go from your people, that's your Moladeth, and your father's household, that's your Baith, to the land I will show you. So what is God asking Abram to give up? Everything, really, isn't it? I mean, at least everything that's settled in his life, his land, his people, his tribe, his nation, his father, his family, his permanent residency. All of those. What's that?
He's asking Abraham to give up control.
That's exactly right. Yeah, you give up control, but you're not going to have any of it. Why would he do this? I mean, is this a good deal, you think? If you're Abram?
Because of his faith in God.
He has faith in God, Bob, right? That's right. But wouldn't you like some sort of, like some details would be nice, God? Like which direction am I going in?
Like at least a little outline.
Yeah, yes, give me something to I mean, because God, I have to go tell Sarah that we're moving. And she's going to ask questions. And I'm going to have to be able to answer those questions, God. Come on. But God doesn't give him any of that, does he? But he does promise him something. What does he promise him? First, he says he'll make Abram into a great nation. That's quite a promise to a Bedouin who is well advanced in years and has no children. how is he going to make him into a great nation? And second, he promises he will bless Abram and everybody else through him. All peoples on earth will be blessed through you. Now that's pretty dramatic too. If you don't have a real sense of, I don't know, would it take more, sort of greater self-confidence and higher self-image to sort of buy into that? I don't know. I can ask Dr. Jill. She's a psychologist. She might be able to tell us. I mean, what kind of a person responds to that?
A crazy person.
Well, yes. Yes. Yeah. Plus he's hearing the voices. I mean, so it's kind of crazy, isn't it? A little bit further on, he's going to promise him something else too. Look down in verse 7. The Lord appeared to Abram and said, what?
Said, unto thy seed will I give this land. Okay,
so to your offspring, I'm going to give this land. Not the land he's in right then, or the Chaldees, but the land he's going to take him to. Now, this is going to be repeated over in Genesis 17, verse 8, where the Lord will say, the whole land of Canaan, where you now reside as a foreigner, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and to your descendants after you, and I will be their God. So there is some sort of long-term arrangement on this land too. This is not just going to Abram, it's going to all of his descendants. This is a pretty good promise, and maybe you have to be just a little crazy. But on the other hand, you thought, well, I'm 80, I've done everything here. Let's go see where something else is going on. Maybe this is an attractive idea. Only how long does this all take?
Well, over 400 years, I guess.
Well, I'm just talking about for Abram. How long does it take for him?
I think he was
75 when he left, and what?
Yeah, well, he's 70.
He was 100 when Isaac was born.
Yeah, but let's clarify. He's 75, not when he leaves Ur, but when he leaves where? It's in verse 4. Haran, okay? He's 75 when he leaves Haran. Where is Haran? Well, it's about halfway from Ur to Canaan. We would probably where we would call northeast Syria now. In other words, he hasn't made it all the way to the promised land. Why did they stop in Haran?
Do we know?
Joshua 24:2 gives us a little hint. But Abram's father, Terah, who's with them, had some trouble giving up his pagan gods. He brought him with him. And he found some more in Haran, and he didn't want to go any further. He's older, if he's Abram's father, and Abram's, already in his 70s. So we don't know how long he's there, but he's there long enough to do something rather significant, because when he leaves Haran, it says he goes with his wife Sarah, his nephew Lot, and all the possessions they had accumulated and the people they had acquired in Haran. So Abram's apparently made his fortune in Haran. Maybe this is part of God's plan. Stop here, get some resources, take them with you. I don't know. But the bottom line is this is not where he's supposed to be. So when they leave there, he's 75. Where do they go to in the promised land? Verse 6 will tell us this. Travel through the land as far as the side of the great tree of Moreh at Shechem. some of you have been to Israel. How many of you have been to Shechem? It's also called Nablus in today's country. It's a really fascinating place. If you go there, you'll find Jacob's well is there. And you can even find the well if you go down in the basement of the Orthodox Church where it is, and you also pay the Orthodox priest just a little bit of money. He will show you the well of Jacob, and you can draw water from it if you want. Now they don't really give it to you. Let me see if I've got.
Oh, what happened?
But for just a few shekels, you can buy a little pitcher of water from Jacob's well. It has been drawn from it, and it's sealed over very carefully so you don't spill the water ever. Shechem is an important place in the life of the nation of Israel. We can think of Shechem as the Bethlehem of the Old Testament, because that's where the plan of salvation goes to ground. Joshua 8:30 will tell us that after the conquest of Canaan hundreds of years later, after Abraham, it's there at Mount Abel, which is close to it, where Joshua builds an altar to the Lord according to the plans given by actually Moses, and they read the book of the law and they reaffirm the covenant. For Abram, however, Shechem becomes the place where the promise of the land is first given. And from there, if you can read on, Abram will go a little bit to the east to Bethel, meaning house of the Lord, where he will build an altar as well. But when a famine hits the promised land, not the one you're thinking of, this is the one before it, but it has the same result. Abram goes south. He goes to Egypt for a while to escape the famine in the promised land. And that's where he has trouble with his wife, with his beautiful wife, Sarai, who's being eyed by the bin in Egypt. He eventually comes back out of Egypt, back through the Negev, which is that desert in the southern part of the Sinai, and that's where he and his nephew Lot part ways, and he goes back to Bethel. And from there, Abram goes to live near the great trees of Mamre at Hebron. That's where we're going to go shortly. In Genesis 15, we can read about how God renews his covenant with Abram, and specifically God promises him a son. Now again, it's a rather lofty promise, especially given his age. He's now nearing 100. I just got to say, if I was close to 100 and God told me I was going to have kids, I would just go ahead and die right there. I would say, take me, Lord, now. We just had 3 grandchildren for 2 weeks from England, and we're exhausted. I mean, we absolutely are worn out from that. I can't imagine having kids at that age. But what does God say? He says, look, Abram, look up at the stars in the sky. Abram says, okay, I'm looking. God says, count them. What? Count the stars in the sky. Because if you can count the stars in the sky, that's how many descendants you will have. I think Abram was a little blown away, so God gives him an easier task. He said, okay, look at the sand in the desert. Count the grains of sand instead. That's how many descendants that you'll have. So this covenant is sealed, by the way, with a ceremony called it's called the covenant of salt. It's common across the area. Jeremiah 34:19 tells us about this actual ceremony. When 2 parties make a covenant or an agreement, they sort of sign the agreement by taking a heifer and a goat and a ram, each 3 years old, and then a dove and a pigeon, and they cut the animals in half. They put them on either side, and both parties of the covenant walk between them. Okay, And what does that symbolize? It is to say, if I break the covenant that we're making this day, may it be to me as it was to these animals. I mean, it's a very solemn way to sort of sign your name onto something. It's a whole lot more dramatic than having it sort of stamped by a seal with another republic. This is something drastic going on. And the other thing about this covenant that is going to be made here in Genesis is that Abram doesn't walk between the animals. God walks between the animals. It's a torch. It's a flame of torch. But by night, it says. In other words, this is a unilateral covenant God is making with Abram. Now, Abram by this time is in his 90s, and when he's 99, God changes his name from Abram, which means an exalted father, meaning that more in the sense of an elder, a tribal leader. He changes it to Abraham, which means father of many, with a connotation of actual parenthood, having progeny. Isaac is born, and then you know all the rest of that story. But this is a dramatic moment for Abram, and that brings us to the segment for tonight, Genesis chapter 23, which we're going to come to the death of Sarah. Jack Beck is going to tell us about that, but he's going to tell us first of all a little bit more about that hill country and what it means to actually live there. And as you're listening to this, see if you can draw the parallels between what it means to live in the hill country and what it means for Abram to actually follow God. Okay, Oliver, if you'll show the video now, we'll watch that now.
When I leave Jerusalem, I feel like I can breathe again. I love Jerusalem stories. I love sharing Jerusalem stories, but I feel like when I'm in the city, I'm holding my breath. And here, I just let it out. This is the environment that I feel most alive in. But I have to tell you, life here was hard. It was really difficult, and it shaped the way people thought, and it shaped the way people believed. The Bible is a local book. Its stories and its poetry and its metaphors can't be moved to other locations and have the same impact as they do when you read them as part of this space. So let me help you get to know the Judean Hill Country just a little bit better. You can see that we're in the central mountains of this land, and they are big mountains. Very steep slopes, 60% of which is eroded to bedrock, and they plunge and terminate in these very, very narrow V-shaped valleys below us. The only natural farm field that exists is at the very bottom of this system. And if you're only going to farm that, you only have food from a very few acres. The only option, you have to build. Yes, you have to build your own farmland, acre by acre by acre by acre, bringing the soil from the bottom of the valley up to your terraced field, bagful by bagful, day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year. It takes 4 to 12 years to build just 1 acre of farmland here. That means that you build farm fields mostly for your children and grandchildren rather than for yourself. When the land takes generations to prepare for cultivation, it becomes an extremely valuable inheritance. So when we read about God's foundational promises to Abram and Sarah in the book of Genesis, a promise of ownership and prosperity, it is significant. Abraham had followed God's call, given over 50 years earlier, to leave his father's land in the east and migrate to this land. Abraham was a foreigner, an immigrant. Abraham even gives himself the title Ger. This means he is someone living off the land, someone who doesn't own land, a temporary resident. none of these imply belonging. And so, Abraham waited for God's promise to come to life. He waited and waited and waited. Abraham and Sarah were now both over 120 years old, and like those who had built the terraced fields around them, they wondered if they would ever see the result. We're in Hebron, about 18 miles south of Jerusalem, and it's about as far south as you can get in Judah's hill country. We're here to talk about one of the saddest and the most enduring of the Judean hill country stories at this location, the Machpelah, or the tomb of the patriarchs. As readers of Scripture, we've been waiting since Genesis 12 to find Abraham in possession of the land the Lord had promised to give him. God had not kept the promise he had made to Abraham and Sarah. He had promised Abraham growth in his family. He had promised him land, and he had promised him that from that family, on that land, blessing would be restored to the nations. But the moment comes into sharp focus when the family faces a crisis. Sarah has died, and they have no personal property to use as the family tomb. Abraham grieved. I mean, the text talks about his pouring out his heart over the loss of his beloved Sarah. He drags himself to the ancient city gate of Hebron and inquires if there might be someone here who would be willing to sell him a field with a cave where he might bury her. That's where the story comes in that involves this location here, the tomb of the patriarchs. Ephron the Hittite steps up and begins the bargaining process. He says, "Oh, what is land cost between friends? Take it. The field and the cave that I own, they're yours." Abraham responds, "Look, I'll pay a fair price," his grief weighing him down. Ephron comes back, "Okay, you know, it's worth 400 shekels, but what's that between friends?" Abraham says, "Okay." The bargaining that we would expect him to make is simply absent, his grief holding him back. And he takes his beloved Sarah and places her here. And only at this moment, when the deal is sealed with Ephron the Hittite, do we find the family that had been promised land actually owning deeded property. And what's also interesting about this place is that Abraham and some of his promised descendants were also buried here. Abram's son Isaac and his wife Rebekah, and then Isaac's son Jacob with his wife Leah. That's actually why Herod the Great built this incredible monument here. It's a 39-foot high wall that surrounds the field and the cave. It's because people throughout the Old Testament era and into the New Testament era and to this very moment come here to remember the vital relationship between this place and the promises that God made to Abram in Genesis 12. The promise of God not only started here. Through Sarah's death, it took root here. It wasn't until Sarah was buried in the ground that the promise began to be fulfilled. The promise of blessing, of light, of truth, not just for Abraham and his family, but for the whole world. But just like the labor-intensive, slow and persistent construction of the Judean hill country cultivated land, the promise would only fully blossom for a future generation.
Okay. Get me back on. Well, I'm going to see if it will let me come back. All right, there we go. So start with a simple question. How does the hill country in Judea shape the people who live there and the stories of their lives?
It's a hard land, and they don't they look far into the future. That they're not looking for something to happen right away. They're planning for their children and their children's children and generations beyond that.
Mm-hmm. It's a tough place to sort of eke out a living. Now, I mean, if they'd had a service industry, everybody just, but they're agricultural. You got to grow the farm food, Deuteronomy, the 11th chapter, 10th verse, gives us a little crystal detail about those terraced farms. Before they enter Canaan, God tells Moses and the Israelites that the land they're going to enter is not like Egypt. He says, where you planted your seed and irrigated it by foot, as in a vegetable garden. Now, how did they do that? Because where does the water come from in Egypt?
The Nile.
It comes from the Nile, yeah. And it comes from irrigation canals from the Nile. And so all the fertile land is along the banks of the Nile. And what do? You dig a little irrigation ditch and you run water so that it'll come onto your crops and onto your farm. And when you need to water, you take your foot and you just push aside the little hole in the dirt and the water flows through it, okay? And it irrigates them. Some commentators will say that this was actually a way of saying that God was saying, see how much better the land is in Canaan, because you won't have to do that anymore. I don't think that's what he means by it. I lean the other direction, because in contrast, God says the land they're going to is the land of mountains and valleys that drinks rain from heaven. Okay, what does that mean? It means they're dependent upon God entirely. There is no irrigation systems. There's no river. I mean, the Jordan River there's a couple of little streams, but the Jordan is the only real river on all of Canaan. It's not much today. It looks a lot like Buffalo Bayou at many places. It was more then, but before water was diverted and dams were built, and it was estimated that it was 40 times the stream in biblical days as it is now. Which made it more formidable, say, for Joshua and the Israelites to have to cross over. But that's it. And and all around it is that Jordan River Valley, which, as we said, was pretty dry and not very arable. And so it's not a good farm growing area, even around the Jordan River. So you really are dependent upon that 22 inches of rain or a little bit more to the west of Jerusalem that comes in the hill country, or slightly more than that up in Galilee. But that's how you grow. So like we said, it is a tough place. And so you live, as Jack said, and also Tricia sort of reiterated for us, you live with a long-term view in effect, that you do something that you'll never benefit from, probably. You plant trees that won't produce fruit for a long time. You build terraces on the land, on the hillsides, that'll take you a good while to actually build. And then you have to maintain them, and you have to build walls around them, and you have to watch out for the foxes, You have to watch out for other little animals which will come there. So you have to build a watchtower somewhere there that you can live on premise and sort of keep guard over all of it. It's a lot, but you're living for your children and your grandchildren. Anyone feel like you do that now? Like you're living for your children and your grandchildren sometimes? Most of your resources are going there, and certainly most of your kind of attention. I mentioned that we had our kids from England here the last 2 weeks. It was great to have them here. They have, our grandchildren have very pronounced English accents.
This is just nothing. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. But at any rate, those grandchildren talk to their cousins from Katy who have very pronounced Texas little twangs. And it was like watching the Patty Duke show. I mean, you know, you had identical cousins, you know, but they're talking very differently. You live for your children sometime, and you live for your grandchildren. So how do you suppose that makes Abram and Sarah, who don't have any children, or grandchildren, feel in that kind of a society?
Inadequate.
Very sad, very left out.
Yeah, they're left out, you know, and I mean, there's a kind of a really sad little verse where Abram says to sort of God, you know, I guess the son of Eleazar, who's my servant, can inherit everything. You know, there's anybody else. So for God to make this promise to them is not simply to grant them personal fulfillment. It is to bring them into the culture around them, into the society all around them. Do you have a different feel for Abram and Sarah?
Well, I look at Abram. Now you said they were from around the Babylon area.
Yes. From
and I would like to try to figure out God's foreplan. Why is this land of Canaan so important to where they wanted them to just load up the vehicle and move down into this land? And even though it's home to Judaism and Muslim and Christianity, in God's foreplan, why is this land so important to where, even though Abram listened to the still small voice, he listened to the revelation to get there, but it must be a very important geographical area.
Yeah, and I think that's right, although now my mind has gone off when you said load up the vehicle to the Beverly Hillbillies. Granny on the rocker on the top of the truck.
Camels or whatever the travel aids were.
Yeah, you know, I think that's a great question, Mike, but I think part of it is that what we will see is that this land is of a particular choosing of God for a whole host of reasons, not the least of which is it is the land between everything else. It's the land bridge between Europe, Asia, and Africa. It's where every civilization is going to have to pass through. It's where the gospel can find a hearing and can spread through the whole world. And so I think it does become an important place. It's also a land where God is going to test the Hebrew people, Abram's family, in order to help them learn how to trust. For whatever reason, Ur of the Chaldees, Babylonia, Mesopotamia, does not have those kinds of characteristics to it. This is why God brings him to where he wants to effect his plan of salvation for the whole world. Let's read one more passage, but the Jack references Genesis 23 on the death of Sarah. Sarah lived to be 127 years old. She died in Hebron in the land of Canaan. And as you heard, Abram says to the Hittites, who are the people living there, would somebody please sell me some land so I can bury my wife? And you see this kind of whole back and forth going on until that happens. How do you suppose Abram feels when Sarah dies and he has no place to even bury her?
Distraught.
Yeah, yeah. It's a very uncomfortable feeling. Our experience was living in parsonages for 38 years of our marriage. And all that time, we had some very nice homes, but none of them were our home. And for all of those years, I have to confess that I kind of worried. I worried what would happen to Julie and the children if something happened to me, because they couldn't stay in the parsonage. They'd have to move out. They'd have to find someplace else. They'd have to do something else. And then the children graduated and went away to school. And then I thought, well, what's going to happen to us when we retire? Because we can't stay in the parsonage. We're going to have some place. And so when we built a columbarium, when we were up at Lakewood serving there, Julie and I bought a niche that could hold 2 urns for our ashes. And we called it it was the parsonage. And that was the only real estate we owned on the face of the earth, was that little square box that we could put 2 urns into. It's the only real estate we owned until we bought a house, our first house, at the age of 60. Sold it at the age of 61. Not a good plan in terms of financial return. And then built a second house here when we moved here into Fort Bend County. I can't begin to tell you what a difference that has made in our lives, to have this place, which is ours. Well, it's ours and the bank's. To have this place that and no offense to anyone that's ever served on a parsonage committee, nobody has a key to our house. Nobody just comes in to sort of check things every once in a while. Nobody, does all the things which even though they're gracious, they just feel like, well, we're just tenants. We're just sort of, caretakers of the facility. And now that our daughter Angie and her husband Steve is an Anglican priest, they're in a similar setup in the Church of England. They live in church-owned manses or houses. And we realized again how important it is that they don't have a permanent home. So now our house is sort of home base for everybody. And there is a place that we can call our own. I have this enormous empathy for Abram, that until he finds this place where he can even bury Sarah, he doesn't feel like he belongs, really. He doesn't really feel like he's a part of the community. He feels like a transient. I don't know. It's an interesting kind of scenario as you walk through all of this. What other reactions or insights from tonight's video session come up in your mind? Anything?
I don't know about the video per se, but it's amazing that Abraham's faith.
Yes.
In other words, everything you've said, you could almost think nobody in their right mind would do that. Leave a perfectly good home with fields and family and go off to a place that you have to, if you could even scratch out a living, you could, to a place that's not your own, with people that's not your own, and then to get run off to Egypt in the middle of a drought or famine, come back and not even have an heir, never waver, never doubt.
There's a very good reason why Abraham is celebrated in the New Testament for his righteousness, not his righteousness, but his belief in God's righteousness. Abraham believed in God, Hebrews says, and it was credited to him as his righteousness. And so I think that's a tremendous kind of story for us, isn't it? Because we tend to not want to take God quite that seriously, and we really hope he doesn't ever call us to do something like that.
I have to say, I so related to your story about the parsonage. I'm a preacher's kid. I lived in parsonages all my life. And you always feel like you're on display or just very not secure. I know that bothered my mother tremendously over the years.
Yeah, I mean, at least being a Methodist preacher, I knew that I didn't have to worry about saying something wrong on Sunday morning and being fired by the deacons on the same day. But I was always conscious of the fact that this is not permanent, and this can change. And it's an interesting life. Our son, the minute he got out, he said, Dad, I love the Lord and I love you all. I will never be a preacher. I do not want to live that life,
It's a hard one.
Yeah, and I'm so proud of him because he's a tremendous Christian, and he's very active in his church, which is Grace Fellowship out in Katy, and he does great things. But Dan, Adam, and David may tell you the same thing. I don't know. I suspect Adam is more open to it than David might be one day.
My sister did everything she could to talk her son-in-law out of going into the ministry. But the other thing I reacted to in terms of the story tonight was the whole issue of, had Abraham and Sarah had children, it might have been harder for them to leave.
Yes, exactly.
Kids have a way of planting you.
Yes.
And so maybe that was part of the plan too.
Yeah, there was no PTA to have to leave. Yeah.
No.
No
little league. No.
That's a very good thought, Jill, because God has a purpose for all of our lives. We don't know what it is until later. And the really scary thing about Abraham to me is that he's so old when he gets this call. I'm thinking, oh, come on, God, if I get to that age, leave me alone.
Yeah, when you're safe.
I should be safe by now from something like this. Any other thoughts tonight? Okay, so next week we're going to move up to the northern part of the country and go hang gliding with Jack in the Jezreel Valley. Then we'll close this series 2 weeks from tonight, just before Thanksgiving, with the trip to Megiddo. Many of you have been to Megiddo. Others of you have not been there. You don't know it, but you might know it better by its other name, Har Megiddo. Har meaning mountain, the mountain of Megiddo. Har Megiddo, or Armageddon, as it's called in Revelation. So we'll finish there. But I think we're going to do one final study on Sunday, December 20th, the Sunday night prior to Christmas, because Jack has a journey to Bethlehem and the Nativity Church. And I think that'd be a good time for us to sort of take a little trip to Bethlehem. So we'll get word out to you on that one as a kind of a bonus session just before Christmas. Okay, so thank you for being here tonight, and just checking the chat. Okay, and we will see you next Tuesday night. Blessings, everyone.
All right. Thank you. Good night.
Good night. Hey, Sally, good to see you.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Here too. Gracious people I didn't see.